And I wanted to begin tonight by reading to you a message that a Muslim girl from France who fled to Syria to join the Islamic State in 2012 wrote to her mother. This is a teenage girl, and she said, "Mom, you're too materialistic. All that matters to you is finding your daughter. You should know that I am no longer your daughter. I belong to Allah. I will never return to the land of the unbelievers. If your government of unbelievers should come to find me with an army, we will execute every last one of them. The truth will win out, and we are afraid of nothing. We love death more than you love life." We love death more than you love life is something that not only this girl from France said, but that many, many Islamic jihadis have said over the years, and that the Islamic State jihadis never tire of repeating. We will win, they say, because we love death more than you love life. And that is why it is good that you came here tonight, and that is why it's so important that you came here tonight. Because what we have in the struggle with ISIS, the Islamic State, as they call themselves, is not just a struggle against a terrorist group that may wreak havoc in the United States, although it is certainly that. What we have is not just a struggle with a group that has ruined the lives of countless numbers of people in Iraq and Syria, as well as elsewhere, and that we owe it to those people to try to combat it in the name of human rights, although it is certainly that. But what we have is something more than either one of those things, and that is nothing less, and this is not an overstatement, than the final struggle between life and death. Now, you may think, well, wait a minute, you've really just gone off the deep end here. Are you talking some apocalyptic fantasy? Well, actually, the Islamic State thinks that that is exactly what they're going to bring about. The apocalypse, the final battle between the Muslims and the non-Muslims, which they envision happening in 10 years in Dabiq, a town in northern Syria that they already control. And whether or not that's really going to happen within the next 10 years, there is a fundamental choice in how human life is to be pursued and how human society is to be ordered that the Islamic State presents to each and every one of us, even now, before American armies ever get to Dabiq and fight the Muslims, if they ever do. And that is because the Judeo-Christian civilization, Western civilization, whatever your relationship to Judaism or Christianity may be, whether you are committed to one or the other or to neither one, the fact is that our entire civilization and culture and worldview is based on love for life. That God is the creator of all life, and that life is good, is worthy of respect, and that creation and creativity are good things that are valued and ought to be respected as well. And so you see that all over. If you go to Europe and you see the ancient Roman artifacts, and they were not destroyed because we respect what the Romans built and what they made. And we respect the thinkers, the Hebrew thinkers of the Jewish scriptures, and the Greek thinkers, Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and the others, who together formed the bases upon which Christian Europe was built and formed the habits of mind and the core assumptions that led to our understanding of human rights, our understanding of the equality of dignity of all people, our understanding of the value of each human life, and so very much more. It's a struggle between life and death. You either love life or you love death. What we have in the Islamic State are, by their own admission, the lovers of death. The Quran says, "Oh, you who are Jews," because the Quran is always haranguing the Jews, and the Quran says, "You who are Jews and you say, we are children of God and His beloved, then prove it by showing that you love death." Now, wait a minute. If you are actually children of God and His beloved, then you'll love life, because God is life and the author of life. And even if you are not a believer in any particular religious creed, you still have the choice in your own life. You're going to love life or you're going to love death. You're going to love creation, or you're going to love destruction. And ultimately, these two impulses have clashed many times in human history. The struggle between the Nazis and the Western powers was not ultimately only about who was going to hold hegemony in Europe. It was about whether we would ultimately be lovers of life or lovers of death. Whether we would celebrate the philosophy that could absolutely unapologetically and even proudly send millions upon millions of people to be murdered, or whether we would stand up and say that's an abomination because every human life has value, and so we're going to fight against you and stop you from doing that. And now here we come again, and we have yet another confrontation between the lovers of life and the lovers of death. The Islamic State has recently gotten quite a bit of attention for destroying the Roman ruins, not actually ruins, but the ancient Roman buildings at Palmyra in Syria, and the winged Assyrian horses that were in the museum at Mosul and elsewhere. They destroyed those things because the Quran, the holy book of Islam, also says, go around the world and see what became of the civilizations that rejected Allah. What are you supposed to see when you go around the world and look at the civilizations that rejected Allah? You're supposed to see ruins, because Allah is supposed to have judged them. If the ancient Roman buildings are still standing, it's incumbent upon the Islamic State to destroy them, because that shows the judgment and the power of Allah. The Quran says, fight them, that is the unbelievers, and Allah will punish them by your hands. They are the wrath of God. They are the wrath of their God. And the wrath of their God is manifest in destroying and killing. It's the love of death versus the love of life. We respected those ancient artifacts and preserved them and kept them so that we could learn about the ancient cultures and civilization and thereby enrich our own. They only see this as an occasion to show the judgment of Allah. We need to create ruins. These people have rejected Allah. We need to kill them. What they hope this will all culminate in is that final battle at Dabik. Now, they didn't just pick Dabik, which is a small town, 3,000 people in northern Syria. Maybe it's got a thriving apocalypse tourist trade by now, I don't know. But there's otherwise no reason to go there. But as it happens, Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, if he existed, actually even if he didn't, there is attributed to him a statement whereby he said that the final battle between the Muslims and the non-Muslims will happen when the Romans will show up at Dabik, and there will be the final showdown, followed by the victory of the Muslims, and Jesus, the Muslim prophet, will return, break all the crosses, kill the pigs, abolish the jizya, that is, destroy Christianity and conquer and Islamize the world. That's the plan, and the Islamic State hopes to bring this about in 10 years. That's why and this is so important to them, they call their magazine Dabik, after the name of this town. Now, here again, they see this as the final showdown, that it's all coming down. Whether it is or not, they're going to be working toward it and killing a lot of people to try to get there. And they also have plans for before the final battle in the next 10 years. They have quite a lot of plans for conquest and murder on the way to Dabik. One of the main things that they intend to do is conquer Rome. You'll notice that Muhammad is supposed to have said that the Romans will come and fight at Dabik. This is because at the time that these stories were fabricated, the Roman Empire was a Christian empire and was a formidable foe of the Muslim Arabs. And so the statement attributed to Muhammad says the Romans are going to come fight. Nowadays, the Islamic State interprets that as meaning that the Americans will come. The Americans as the final exponent of that Judeo-Christian civilization that went from ancient Israel and ancient Greece into Europe, into the Roman Empire, and into England, and finally to the United States. And so we are, in effect, the Romans, and are going to go there and fight them. Before that, they're going to conquer Rome itself, because another prophecy attributed to Muhammad is that first, he said, you will conquer the new Rome, and then you will conquer the old Rome. The new Rome being Constantinople, the second capital of the Roman Empire, founded by Constantine in the 4th century. Constantinople was conquered by the Muslims in 1453, 700, 800 years after Muhammad is supposed to have lived and died. Now, it's 700 years more or less, after that, and many Islamic imams and scholars and spokesmen have said now is the time for the second half of the prophecy to be fulfilled. New Rome, Constantinople, was conquered, and now it's time for old Rome. Now, how on earth can the Islamic State, a group of terrorists who, because of a power vacuum in Iraq and Syria, are now able to rule over an area larger than Great Britain, but still a terrorist group, how do they have any idea that they will conquer Rome, much less bring about this final apocalyptic battle? Mind you, they are not thinking that they're going to amass a conventional army and march into Italy and conquer Rome. As a matter of fact, last February, they explained to us, as after the manner of Hitler and Mein Kampf, exactly what they were going to do and how they're going to do it. And they said last February that they're going to flood Europe with 500,000 refugees. Does that sound familiar? Do you think conceivably there could be any connection to this present refugee crisis? Of course, world leaders Barack Obama, David Cameron, Angela Merkel, all the rest of them, they all are sure that, of course, that there's no possible connection between the Islamic State threatening to flood Europe with refugees just a few months ago and Europe being flooded with refugees now. Any connection would be inconceivable. However, the Islamic State, a spokesman from them recently said, well, we've already got 4,000 of our men into Europe among the refugees, and more coming all the time. Even more ominously, just a few days ago, the Lebanese education minister met with David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and said to him, we have 1.1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. They're not staying in Lebanon. Lebanon's just right next door. They're on their way to Europe. And that of those 1.1 million refugees, he said, 2% at least are active Islamic jihadis. That's 20,000 men. That's in the refugee camps in Syria, on their way to Europe now. How many are already in Europe? How many is Barack Obama going to bring over when he pitches in and aids the refugee crisis by bringing them over here? See, the Islamic State always pictured that they would conquer us not by conventional warfare, but by subversion and infiltration. And exactly that is what is happening. Subverting the existing order in Europe. And meanwhile, their allies and friends in the West are stigmatizing and demonizing the people who are calling attention to this, so that Paul very kindly pointed out to you that I can't go to Great Britain and am barred from there because it's nothing personal. The government is afraid to offend its growing Muslim population. And they had barred a few Islamic jihadis, and they thought, well, this looks bad. We have to bar some other people so we're not just barring Muslims, because then the Muslims will be angry with us. And so they barred us and some others. And the fact is, though, that the more that resistance to this and calling awareness to this and speaking realistically about this threat is indeed marginalized in this manner, then obviously the fewer people you're going to get who will be willing to do it. And then if everyone is afraid to speak out about the threat while these refugees are pouring in, and everybody knows that only racist, bigoted Islamophobes would dare suggest that there could be jihadis among them, well, nobody will say a word, and the whole operation can advance unimpeded and unopposed. And so it works very well, subversion and infiltration. And the upshot is this. A Polish convert to Islam who joined the Islamic State, he recently said, we're going to storm the Vatican and we're going to hold mass beheadings in St. Peter's Square. How inconceivable is it, really, that that could happen? If say 20,000 jihadis were to descend upon Europe and make a concerted action, how really difficult to believe is it? They might not be able to hold Rome. They might not be able to establish an Islamic State in Europe, at least not at this time. But could they overrun it? Could they behead the Pope and many others in St. Peter's Square? Well, there's absolutely no doubt that that is a very distinct possibility, and that it wouldn't really take a whole lot of people to pull it off. If you think about it, nobody would have predicted in January 2014 that the Islamic State would indeed hold a territory larger than the size of Great Britain in Iraq and Syria. Nobody thought they could pull it off. Barack Obama dismissed them as the JV team. And even Al-Qaeda. One of the things that you'll see in the book is that Al-Qaeda wanted to establish a caliphate in Iraq 10 years ago. You remember Abu Musab al-Zarqawi? He was the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And he was corresponding with Ayman al-Zawahiri, the second in command, the Al-Qaeda second banana, and now the head man in Al-Qaeda since Osama was killed. And they were talking about, we're going to establish a caliphate here, and Zarqawi was all for it. But Zawahiri said, no, wait. And Osama bin Laden himself put the brakes on the idea. He said, if you do that, the Americans will come in and will level the caliphate and embarrass the Muslims worldwide. Zarqawi and his group, after he was killed in 2006, they said, no, we're going to do this, and Allah will bless it. The caliphate was established on June 29th, 2014, and has only grown since then. And so pathetic has the American response been. Do you remember Baghdad Bob, the Iraqi information minister? Yeah. And how he was saying, the Americans are nowhere near Baghdad, and then the American tanks would go by in the background while he was on the screen. And, you know, he was an international joke. But now the Pentagon, a few months ago, published a map saying, look how well the airstrikes have worked. And the Islamic State has lost 40% of its territory. And they left out all the territory that the Islamic State had gained in the same time period. They actively falsified the map and were exposed doing so. And recently there was a large number, I think about 50 intelligence agents who said that their reports on ISIS had been falsified after they submitted them to make them look better than they were. And so what we have is, on the one hand, the lovers of death are actively working by means of subversion and infiltration to wreak havoc in Europe and then in the United States, to overturn the existing order. Not by a direct frontal assault, but by the death of 1,000 cuts, by overwhelming law enforcement with so many attacks, so many plots, that it can't keep up, and ultimately it's overwhelmed and collapses. And on the other hand, we have people playing politics and denying and just trying to fool the American public for their own political gain, rather than confronting it fully. And so the struggle between life and death is going to continue. Imagine what would happen if they were let loose in Europe. Do you think that the destroyers of Palmyra would hesitate to smash the David or to destroy the Louvre? There's so many things in Europe they could destroy. They would love it, because that's what they're all about, is destruction and death. If we are going to deal with this realistically, then we have to, in the first place, deal with it realistically. And that is the one thing that no one is doing at this point. Not government, not law enforcement, not the media, nobody. You may recall that the Nazi Germany was the first country in the world to have a ministry of propaganda. And this was because it was a state built on lies. Lies and death and all of it, they all go together. And a state built on lies has to constantly insist, has to constantly yell at you and tell you how things are, because you can see with your eyes that things are one way, and they want you not to think that. They want you to think they're another way, so they have to constantly tell it to you, because otherwise you'll forget and just go back to seeing things as they are. That's just the natural order of things. Today, if you turn on CNN or read the New York Times or the Washington Post or any one of the other ones, you will see a steady stream of articles or a steady procession of talking heads telling you the Islamic State has nothing to do with Islam. And Barack Obama will tell you that, and David Cameron, and John Kerry, and Joe Biden, and every last other leader in the Western world. They all agree that Islam is a fine and wonderful thing, and there's this perversion of it that's ruining everything for everyone. In the first place, there are 30,000 Muslims from around the world who have gone to Iraq and Syria and to ISIS holdings in Libya to join the Islamic State. They have done so because they accept its understanding, its self-description as the caliphate, the sole legitimate government for Muslims worldwide. They go there because they see how everything they do, everything, even the most savage and bloody things that they do, is based on the Quran and the example of Muhammad. Muslims can read the Quran. John Kerry and Joe Biden read it and they see a wonderful book of peace, but somehow this eludes all those Muslims who've gone to join the Islamic State. I think John Kerry and Joe Biden and Barack Obama and David Cameron really ought to give Quran lessons to all these Muslims. Because somehow they don't see what is patently obvious to all our leaders. But you know, it's an adage as old as warfare. You can't defeat an enemy you don't understand. And you certainly cannot defeat an enemy that you refuse to understand. And this is the situation that we're in now. The mainstream media has to keep pumping out these articles about how ISIS has nothing to do with Islam, and ISIS is violating various tenets of Islam, and all these Muslims are protesting against or fighting against ISIS. They have to keep pumping them out, just like the Goebbels propaganda ministry had to keep pumping out the Nazi nonsense, because it's so counterfactual, it's so much of a lie, it's so contrary to what we see with our own eyes, that if they don't keep insisting on it, then it will fall away from people's consciousness. And that's what it should do, because it is a lie. The Islamic State is recruiting from among peaceful Muslims and is justifying its actions based on core teachings of the Quran and Muhammad. If we're going to confront and defeat it, then we have to confront that fact and deal with it realistically. That would lead in turn to a reconfiguration of our global alliances. For example, every year since 9/11, we've been giving over $1 billion to Pakistan to fight Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And you may know that in 2008, which is now 7 years ago, it was revealed that the Pakistani spy service, the ISI, not to be confused with the ISI that published my book, Did Muhammad Exist? The Pakistani spy service was actually funneling a great deal of that money to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. What do you think the response to this revelation was in the US Congress? You're right, give the Pakistanis more money. And they did. Because obviously if they're having to give money to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban out of what we give them, they must not have enough, the poor dears. And so if we give them more, then presumably they will not give any to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. This, of course, doesn't make any sense at all, but it keeps going on. Vladimir Putin just a few weeks ago called for an international alliance against terrorism, and Barack Obama refused because Vladimir Putin is helping Bashar Assad, who's no doubt a scoundrel, against the Islamic State. But if Bashar Assad is removed, the Islamic State takes advantage, wins a huge victory, and is that much closer to Lebanon, to Israel, and to Europe. So Vladimir Putin is dealing with this realistically, and Barack Obama is not. And that international alliance is something that could and should be brought about. There are many states, in fact, ultimately all non-Muslim states, are targets of the jihad. Now is the time for us to recognize that and to unite. And while American Muslim advocacy groups have condemned the Islamic State, they've actually done so not because they're moderates and the Islamic State is extremists. They've done so because the American Muslim advocacy groups are all tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been trying to establish a caliphate since 1928. But they never were able to pull it off. So they view the Islamic State as an upstart competitor that stole their thunder. Of course they condemn it. But there is not a single mosque or Islamic school or Islamic organization in the United States, or anywhere in the world for that matter, that has any program to teach Muslims why they should reject the understanding of Islam represented by the Islamic State. That's an extraordinary omission if they really condemn it. And our government authorities, law enforcement officials, ought to be pressuring them on that point. But these things can only be done if we have the guts to face the problem in its full dimensions and face it realistically. And that is exactly not what's happening. Now, the thing about the struggle between life and death is that it's ongoing. The Nazis were going to continue to advance and continue to kill and continue to conquer until they were stopped by force. So also the Islamic State. They have a global vision. They have a global mandate. They're going to keep coming and they're going to keep killing until they're stopped by force. We can either stop them now, it would be not a very difficult thing to do, or we can stop them later when it will be that much more difficult depending on how long we wait. Ultimately, however, they are foredoomed. I would not advise sitting around and waiting for them to go away. They're not going to do that. But ultimately, death never defeats life. Solzhenitsyn spoke about the blades of grass poking through the concrete. And think about that. If you cover ground with concrete, and the concrete is strong, and you would think the ground underneath, everything in it would just die. But it doesn't. And a blade of grass that is so infinitely less strong, infinitely weaker than the concrete, ultimately breaks the concrete and pokes through. And death will never conquer life in the same way. Life will always win out. But it is very possible, and I cannot ignore or paper over this fact, that while life will always conquer death, there is no guarantee given anywhere by anyone, and there's no historical lesson that can be drawn that guarantees that the United States will always be here, or that Western Europe will always be free, or that the republic that we have established here will always remain in its integrity. It could be that the Islamic State will keep advancing, and they will not be able to conquer us full frontally, but they will be able to subvert and infiltrate to the extent that the whole thing collapses. That is a possibility. And it could be that a very dark and bloody age could follow. I don't believe that that would be the end of civilization or the end of people who love life. The people who love life will always triumph. But do we really want to condemn our children and our children's children and maybe generations after that to a life of nothing but struggle and strife and bloodshed? That is what is at stake here. And so it is extraordinarily important that we do all we can, understanding that nobody else is going to do it for us, that we do all we can where we are to raise awareness among those we know about what the Islamic State is and what is at stake. And that we pressure our elected officials to act realistically about this, and in every election cycle to make it absolutely clear to them that we're not going to tolerate this politically correct obfuscation and misinformation and disinformation any longer. The stakes are very high, but we do have the power of life, the power of creation and creativity, and the power of the truth on our side. And so I am confident that we will prevail once we understand exactly the nature of the fight we're in. Thank you very much. Absolutely. How can you can't deal with the Islamic State in isolation, is essentially the observation. And you have to deal with the fact that Iran is there. Iran hates the Islamic State. They're Shiites. The Islamic State is Sunnis. And so to take out the Islamic State would be to aid Iran. To aid Iran against the Islamic State would be to aid Iran. It's a very difficult situation. I think that one thing that we can do is one thing we never did before. And that is, instead of just showering money on places like Pakistan that just waste it or give it to our enemies, you know that we went into Afghanistan and Iraq and oversaw the installation of Sharia constitutions, of constitutions in both countries that said Islamic law is the highest law of the land. So do you understand what we did when we did that? The United States government was saying, you're a woman and you're being beaten and you can't come to us for help. You're a Christian and you're being oppressed and denied work or denied advancement or denied good housing or something because you're not a Muslim, you can't come to us for help. What if we had gone in and stood for our own values and said, if you are a woman who's being beaten, you can come and find refuge with us. Christians, we will protect you. Yazidis, Baha'is in Iran, whoever. We're your advocates and champions. And you can come to us. Imagine, I think, how different the world could be. And I don't think it would be worse. Because I think there are millions of Muslims also who would prefer to live in a society that's free rather than one under Sharia. But Sharia, Islamic law, is an empire of fear. It's based on fear and threat and intimidation. And the only way you can defeat a bully is to stand up to it and say, no more. Yes, I'll fight you. Okay. But you're not going to get away with it anymore. And instead, we said, you can do whatever you want and we'll help.
Robert, can you comment on something? There's been a talking point that's been circulated by the left I've seen the past couple of days, most notably James Cameron. They're all starting to say that the destabilization in Syria is all a result of climate change and because of a drought in the cities. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a very common idea that the global warming ruined the crops in Syria, impoverished the people, thereby radicalizing them. That they turned to jihad to fight against their neighbors because they didn't have enough to eat. And had they had a good harvest, everything would be okay. Now, there's so many things wrong with this. I don't know if we'll have any time for any other questions. In the first place, the Sunni-Shiite conflict is a very key part, as we were just discussing, of what's gone on with the Islamic State. What happened is the Bush administration went into Iraq and said, one person, one vote, and we'll have a free election. And I tell you, I could have made a killing in Las Vegas at that time if I'd wanted to by going in and betting on exactly how the election results would have worked out. Because it was a foregone conclusion. Iraq is 55% Shiite. You could have been absolutely certain that the Shiites would win 55%. And they did. Everybody in Iraq voted along sectarian and tribal lines. Nobody went in and said, they have no tradition of doing this. Said, oh, let's see who these candidates are. Well, this guy's a Sunni and I'm a Shiite, but he's saying things that I agree with, and I'm going to go with the vote for the best man. Didn't happen. The Shiites won because the Shiites have a majority. But the Sunnis had been ruling the country for decades, from Saddam Hussein's time and before. So they were angry and disenfranchised. Meanwhile, Barack Obama pulled the American troops out to fulfill his campaign promise and left a total power vacuum. The Sunnis were never going to accept a Shiite government in Baghdad. And this was when the Sunnis started to wage jihad against the Shiites. It's perfectly clear. You don't have to know what the weather was to see why that happened. And the Sunni-Shiite antagonism goes back 1,400 years. Global warming is supposed to have happened because of automobiles. So, you know, what's your excuse before that? The cows or something? I mean, it's ridiculous. In any case, the point is that this is happening. The Islamic State exists because of a variety of missteps by two American administrations, also exacerbating ancient antagonisms that existed long before carbon emissions. And so the idea that it all comes from that is just that analysis itself is a manifestation of the all overarching desire on the part of Western governments to deny that this has anything to do with Islam, when this is ultimately all that it has to do with. If there were not the Sunni-Shiite divide, the Islamic State would not exist, and there would not be this huge international threat with these people saying, we're going to come and kill you in the streets, excuse me, and you will not be safe in your own beds, and so on. They're saying this because of imperatives within Islam. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask about the refugee crisis. I mean, I was home in London recently and got stuck in the Channel Tunnel because of it. My mother grew up in occupied Holland, and I think there was the feeling that a lot of Jews died in the concentration camps because other countries weren't willing to let them in. Obviously, there's a lot of innocent people that are refugees. I mean, every day we're seeing children, being held up, the people that have been dying on the boats and everything. I mean, it's very, very difficult. I agree. It is posing a huge, huge problem for Europe. But what's the answer? I mean, there has to be a humanitarian response as well. Does Europe just not let any of these people in like Hungary is doing?
Yeah, not let any of them in. And I say that I understand what you're saying about the Holocaust. I understand, but this is not the same thing. In the first place, the refugees in Europe right now, whatever the photographs may be, photographs are anecdotal. They're a picture of a small group of people. The refugees are overwhelmingly young, able-bodied Muslim men. If this were a genuine refugee crisis, you would think there'd be a large number of Christians among them because hundreds of thousands of Christians have been displaced by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Where are the Christians? How come they're not fleeing to Europe? Why are they all men? Where are the women? Where are the elderly and infirm? If these are people who've been displaced from their homes. But even more to the point, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states have said they're not taking in any of the refugees, none. The Saudis said, we won't take in any, but we'll build 200 mosques for them in Germany if you'd like. I get the idea. You see what that's all about. But why won't the Saudis take them? The Saudis won't take them, they said, because there's a terror threat. There are jihadis among them. But if you say that in Europe, you're a racist, bigoted Islamophobe. It's absolutely absurd. These are Muslim refugees from Muslim countries, and there are plenty of Muslim countries that have lots of open spaces that could accommodate them. And they are not going to those places because they won't take them and because they don't want to go there. This is ultimately not a refugee crisis at all. This is a hijra. The hijra is the emigration of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. And that was the first time he became a political and military leader as well as a spiritual one. The hijra is extraordinarily important in Islam. The year one of the Islamic calendar is not when Muhammad was born or when he died or when he became a prophet. Three things you might expect. It's the hijra. It's as if Islam is not Islam without its political and military component. But even more than that, Muhammad's action in this enshrined in Islam the concept of emigration as a holy act. To leave one land and to go to another to Islamize the new land is to imitate Muhammad, which is a great blessing and the greatest thing that a Muslim can do. The jihad terrorists in England, a few years back, they were called al-Muhajirun, the immigrants. And these migrants, when they say migrants, that's what the word means in Arabic. Muhajirun, people who are emigrating for the cause of Allah. Now, are they all immigrating for the cause of Allah? Are there sick and weak and infirm people among them? Certainly. And so if they're already there in Europe, I think they should be given what care they need and then sent home or sent to Saudi Arabia. Anyway, yes, ma'am.
And mostly everybody is 60 years or older, and our children are being indoctrinated. They're being indoctrinated into climate change, and Islam is a religion of peace. Is there any... a great religion of peace. Is there anything that we can do?
Absolutely. Hear about these things. You know, Bill Becker of Freedom X is back here, and Bill is working on a tremendous project with Lori Cardoza Moore out of Tennessee to call attention to the fact that the textbooks in public schools and public universities are whitewashed and present a roseate picture of Islam that does not talk about jihad, does not talk about the imperatives to conquer and subjugate unbelievers that are in the Quran, that all that is just left out. And meanwhile, there are very highly critical portraits of Judaism and Christianity put in, so that the student comes out thinking that his own civilization and culture and heritage is somehow unworthy and corrupt. And you're not going to defend something that you don't think has any value. And this other thing that's coming and saying we're going to conquer, that's the good and noble thing. Well, obviously, the agenda of this is clear, and Bill is working on raising awareness of that. If you have incidents where your children are being specifically taught specific things, you should get in touch with him. And legal action may be in order, or at least we can embarrass them by calling attention to it. There's obviously, they've been doing work on this for many decades, Islamic groups in the United States, and they have all the bases covered. They're in the school system, they're in the media, they're in the academic establishment, they're all over the place. Absolutely, no doubt about it, 100%. But, we may all be 60 years old and whatever, but we're still alive, and we are lovers of life. And so we have to fight for the truth in these matters. Yes, sir.
You alluded to Saudi Arabia, some of these other countries, and Obama has put a lot of emphasis on a coalition. Why aren't we seeing these other countries rallying to defeat ISIS?
Yeah. Obama has put a lot of emphasis on the coalition, so where is it? Why aren't we seeing these countries rally to fight ISIS? You may recall that when the Jordanian pilot was burnt to death, the Jordanian king vowed a very, very strong action against ISIS. Remember that? Still waiting for it. So what is it that, he flew a couple planes. What is it that keeps these countries from doing this? The Saudis don't want ISIS to win. ISIS challenges the legitimacy, as a matter of fact, of every other Muslim government. It says they're the only legitimate Muslim government. So the Saudis are threatened, Jordan is threatened, Kuwait, Egypt, you name it. So why aren't they fighting them? Because the Islamic State really is Islamic. Because the Islamic State is really doing things that are based on Islam. And you know what that means? That means that in Jordan, there are whole cities where there are Islamic State flags all over the place, and everybody in the city is allied with the Islamic State. But they're in Jordan. Same thing in Saudi. If the Jordanian king or the Saudi king or even the Egyptians act too strongly against the Islamic State, they could have an insurrection at home from people who think, hey, the Islamic State is great. What are you doing fighting against it? That shows that you're an apostate, heretical, false Muslim and have to be deposed. So they're really over a barrel.
Where do you think the weakest point is in the Muslim world, and where do you think the strongest point is in America to fight?
It's what I alluded to before, that the weakest point in the Muslim world are the many, many hundreds of thousands of Muslims who are actually sympathetic with our worldview, with our way of life, with our vision of human rights, with the idea of a free society, but they have nobody to speak for them, nobody to defend them, and plenty of risk, real physical risk, if they stand up. And if we had gone into Iraq and Afghanistan and had made it clear we were standing with them, I think millions of people would have flocked to us. But we'll never know, will we? Because we didn't do that.
What's going to be the reaction in Europe? Reverse policy. All Europeans are sitting down and accepting this. Could you paint a picture, perhaps country by country, where appropriate?
European reaction to this has been pretty much like all of European politics lately, an increasing gap between the elites and the majority of the people. And most of the people don't want this huge influx of refugees who are going to change their nation, change their culture, change their way of life forever, and make things more dangerous and more uncomfortable for everyone. Not because of racial issues or cultural issues, but because a lot of them have this supremacist, violent, authoritarian ideology which mandates that they subjugate the natives. Anyway, those people don't have any representatives. There's Geert Wilders in the Netherlands who stood up and called this what it is, but there are very few other European politicians, and of course he's outside the mainstream, as are all of those who are speaking up about this. You take, for example, Sweden. The Sweden Democrats, for whom I have spoken in Sweden, very good group and very young. I was amazed. I went over to, at the invitation of this group, the Sweden Democrat Party, a few years back, and I was like twice the age of everybody, and I thought, these little kids are running for parliament? But of course, you know, I ain't as young as I used to be either. But anyway, they won. They are. The little kids are in parliament now, and they won 16% of the vote in the last election. And you understand, in Europe, that's a very considerable amount when you have dozens of parties. And it's all based, the governments are all based on coalition. And so what happened when the Sweden Democrats won 16% is that the other parties, every last one of them, formed a coalition against the Sweden Democrats. So they had this huge mega party of 84% of the seats in the parliament, which was actually great for the Sweden Democrats, because then they were able to say, see, they're all the same. We're the only one. They're sort of Donald Trump in this regard. We're the only one who's speaking about these issues honestly. And so if you think the way we do, then come to us. And I guarantee you they're going to have much more than 16% as time goes by. But I think also even the governments and the European elites that have allowed this to happen, even they are waking up now and realizing that the situation has gotten out of hand, and that whatever humanitarian component there may be to the refugee crisis, that these people are quite menacing. I mean, another jihadi was caught yesterday, and they keep being caught now, and there are going to be many more who aren't caught. But the Germans, as you noted, have reversed their policy almost immediately, just days after saying, yeah, come on in, we'll take everybody. They're closing the doors. And the Hungarians, of course, closed the doors, and you may have seen the video of these guys, and it looks like Hamas. You know, these guys with masks and Molotov cocktails and rocks, and they're kicking at the gates, and all these Hungarian riot police on the other side, and they're kicking at the gates to get in and screaming Allahu Akbar and throwing rocks. And you think these people are poor refugees who have fled a humanitarian crisis in their country? Come on. And you know, you see these guys on the boats with their selfie sticks, and like, how is it that they're starving and have to leave their country, but they take their selfie stick? Anyway, of course, yes. Yes, sir.
Silent jihadist situation that we have, infiltrating into the country, and with obviously the state of Israel being an extreme isolated situation and being under attack. What are we doing here? What are they doing from a preparation standpoint? Because they're obviously probably acutely aware. There's one group or one country that's acutely aware of what's happening here in the country. What are they doing? And what's the base here in the United States doing to help the state of Israel?
Do you mean what the Israelis are doing? Yes. Well, the Israelis, whatever they're doing, they're not saying, and that's wise, because the more secretive they are, the better. But I don't think there's any doubt that the Israelis realize that Barack Obama has isolated them and stabbed them in the back, and that they're on their own in regard to Iran. And I have tremendous respect for the IDF and for Israeli military planning, and I have every confidence that they're not going to make it easy for the Iranians. But in what particulars, I don't know, and they're not saying. In terms of the base here, I think it's very important that we support Israel more vocally and more energetically than ever. There's an ugly anti-Semitism that is increasingly mainstream and increasingly open in terms of it not being just anti-Zionist but anti-Jewish in the classic Nazi sense, and that it is fueled by this overarching desire to accommodate Muslims and appease Muslims at every turn. And of course, Islamic anti-Semitism, it's not much discussed, but it's very deeply virulent. I was surprised out here, actually, there's a pamphlet that I wrote, apparently. I don't even remember doing it. But I must have, because I don't have any ghostwriters. But Islam and the Jews, and I'm sure in there I must have told the story. But in any case, the Islamic anti-Semitism being so deeply ingrained, and the left being so deeply in bed with very strongly allied with the Islamic supremacists, it makes for this an ugly recrudescence in Europe and increasingly in the U.S. of an open anti-Semitism, especially on campuses. And so the only thing we can do with that is push back and stand up more strongly than ever and try to communicate to people that Israel is on the front lines of the global jihad that threatens us all, and that there is nothing that they can do in terms of concessions of land or ending of settlements or something like that that is ultimately going to do anything but weaken them in regard to that jihad. And that the jihadis will never be appeased and go away by any peace settlement. They have to be met with strength. That's the only thing they understand and respect.
Robert, we have time for 2 more questions.
2 more. Okay, yes, sir.
The first gentleman alluded. I hear a lot of politicians talking about ISIS, and they've taken their eye off of the big picture of the ball, that it's a multi-headed monster, that Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihads and the country of Iran are all the same monster of a malignant, Western, hating, as you say, life-affirming evil. And you hear our politicians say, well, we're going to defeat ISIS, and they've taken their eye off the ball. And of course, our stupid president is now in Syria, turning his back on the Russians, coming on in, working side by side with Hezbollah and in Iran to defeat ISIS. And we have forgotten completely about all.
It's worse than you think. The former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Michael Flynn, he recently was interviewed, and he said that Obama was very avid to arm the Syrian rebels against Assad. And you remember, that was a couple years ago, and it was very important. Assad was using chemical weapons against his own people, and we had to fight Assad. And he ultimately was going to arm the Syrian rebels, and he did. And he said, these are vetted moderates. Well, Michael Flynn, the former head of the DIA, revealed that while he was telling us, Obama was telling us that these were vetted moderates, he actually knew, because he had been given the intel by Flynn himself. He knew that they were Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood, and he armed them anyway. And so not only is the Islamic State a creation of his foreign policy missteps, it's also a direct child of his active policies that he pursued in terms of arming the so-called rebels. They're driving American Humvees and firing American weapons that we gave to rebels to fight Assad, and they turned out to be the Islamic State or allied with the Islamic State, or else these moderate rebels were killed by the Islamic State and the materiel was taken by them. In any case, this is something that is the direct result of American policies, and it's the direct result of American policies that are based on false assumptions about what we are facing, particularly false assumptions about Islam and its role in the region. And so it's the politically correct affirmation that Islam is the religion of peace that has ultimately led to all this. Okay, one more. Yes, sir.
Is government complicity. That I don't think at all Obama or our government don't know what you're saying, but they are involved in it. Is there anybody running for our presidency who you think will, in fact, be on our side? Because right now I don't fear ISIS, I fear our own government.
Well, I certainly understand your point of view. I don't really know. I mean, Barack Obama, he doesn't return my calls. He doesn't answer my emails. So I don't know how much he actively knows. I mean, I certainly think that it was a very telling moment in the 2008 campaign when he was seen reading the book avidly, The Post-American World by Fareed Zakaria. And that was the title Pamela Geller and I used for our book about Obama in 2010, The Post-American Presidency. Because the Post-American World actually posits that the world would be a better place without a superpower. And so if America were weakened economically, militarily, and politically, then things would be much better for the whole world. And I think, well, look at this all these years later. Sure looks like that's the policy Obama has pursued. So I don't know. In terms of the Republican candidates, I'm sorry. Some of them have said some good things. Walker, Cruz, and Jindal have said some good things. Everybody's excited because Donald Trump stands up to the media harassment, stands up to their nonsense, and certainly I respect that. At the same time, after we held our free speech event in Garland, Texas, and our event drawing Muhammad, it wasn't designed to draw Muhammad, really, or mock Muslims or anything of the kind. It was designed to say, if you're going to kill for this, we're going to stand there. If you're going to say, you must not do this or we'll kill you, then we are going to show we're not going to give in to bullying, we're not going to give in to violent intimidation, because that will only encourage more violent intimidation. And so we're going to stand for the freedom of speech, and we did. The jihadis attacked, etc. But then Donald Trump came out and said it was a terrible thing. What are they doing drawing Muhammad? And I think, what do you mean, what are we doing drawing Muhammad? We're standing for freedom. What are you doing endorsing Sharia blasphemy laws? So I can't get behind him. Anyway, on that note, thank you very much.